Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 6th of June of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's go to talk about Vovchansk direction. The Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours they managed to improve their positions for another 400 meters. The official statement of the group of forces north tell us that the Russians mainly were attacking the Ukrainian positions in the area of this industrial zone. And according to information we have, the first Russian squads managed to answer, let's say, the first building of this industrial area and to capture them. First reports of the same type we received yesterday, so most likely the Ukrainians still have possibilities to counterattack the Russians, and as a result of probably counterattacks during the previous days, they managed to restore their positions, and now the Russians started their new waves of attack with the new fears of power. Also, the Russians reported that they are trying to move, let's say, and to improve their positions between the high-rise building area by the name of Citadel and the industrial zone as well. So the Russians are trying to get their positions here, and if they're able to do this, they will cut the high-rise buildings, the Citadel, from the industrial zone, and this will lead to complete defeat of Ukrainians on this direction. But regarding the reports, regarding the updates, we still see that the Russians haven't managed to complete their goals, and that there are very heavy clashes and fierce battles exactly in this area. On the other hand, the Russians are saying that they continue moving further and say on the eastern direction, and during the previous days they managed to capture significant territory, streets, and that they're moving further and further in the direction of the central part from the eastern part. Yet we haven't received even a single geolocation of these movements. This is just reports without any proofs, but let's wait a little bit more, maybe we're going to receive something. Another important thing we received from the Group of Forces North statement is that having completed the transfer of reserves, the armored forces of Ukraine began to occupy the lines to launch a counteroffensive. This is official statement of the Group of Forces North. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians are planning to use few waves of attacks, and the first wave of attack, the Ukrainians are planning to use the recently and newly mobilized forces who doesn't have any experience. The Ukrainians are planning to use them as a meat, and the main purpose of these waves of attacks to exhaust the Russian forces, to exhaust the Russian lines, and after the first waves of attacks, the Ukrainians are planning to introduce experienced forces, and with the help of experienced forces, the Ukrainians are planning to defeat the Russians and to force them to fall back from the Ukrainian territory back on the territory of Russian Federation. This is the plans according to the official statement of the Group of Forces North. On the other hand, we see that the Russians continue improving their positions. Today we got very interesting videos of how the Ukrainians continue hunting and destroying the Russian engineering machines between the borderlands and Vovchansk itself. Another engineering machine was destroyed by the Ukrainian FPV drone strikes. This machine the Russians were using to create another line of trenches and the fortifications. And correct me if I'm wrong, since the beginning of the battle for, let's say, Vovchansk for the previous months, the Ukrainians have destroyed 3 or 4 engineering machines of the armed forces of Russian Federation. When talking about activities, the most interesting and the most, let's say, fierce clashes, according to information we have, we're not talking about Vovchansk, were taking place on the line between Ternova, Varvarovka, Izbitska, Staritsa, Burgovatka, and Rubizhnoye. So as you can see, the biggest number of geolocations are coming exactly from this territory. The first update we got today in the morning, somewhere at 8, 7, or 9 a.m. of the local time, and according to information we have, the Russians assault units carried out several successful attacks in the area of the settlement by the name of Ternova. So this is it. So according to the Russian sources, starting this morning, the Russians made few attacks in the direction of this area, and as a result of those attacks, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to capture additional territories, trenches, and the fortifications. But the question is, what was that? Why the Russians are doing offensive operations? Because you know that when compared the forces of the number of soldiers, units of Russian forces and Ukrainian forces, we see that the ratio is probably 1-2 or 1-3 in Ukrainian favor. The Ukrainians concentrated much more forces in comparison with the Russians, but the question is, so if the Russians has less forces, why they're attacking the Ukrainian positions? And probably that wasn't like an attempt to attack from the Russian side in direction of Ternova. Probably that was an attempt to break the Ukrainian plans to restore the main supply road that goes from Vovchansk to Prilipka, to Burgovatka, Staritsa, and then to Izbitske, Varvarovka, and then to Kharkov. So as we discussed, Just very important statement that I would like you to have and keep you in your mind. Having completed the transfer of reserves, the Russians are saying about the Ukrainians, the armed force of Ukraine began to occupy the lines to launch a counteroffensive. This statement was made based on the results and, let's say, events that took place during the previous 24 hours, including 5th of June. So what is the current situation with Ukraine? When talking about Ukraine's supply and logistic of Vovchansk, now the Ukrainians are using a very big shoulder of support. They're moving their force from Kharkov to Chuguyev, then to Pechenegi, from Pechenegi to Artyomovka, and then from Artyomovka using the local roads to Bely Kolodys. So as you can see, a very big road. The Ukrainians concentrate their forces here, and from Bely Kolodys, the Ukrainians redeploying their forces to the forest, let's say, in the southwestern part of Vovchansk. Using Bely Kolodys, the Ukrainians are sending some forces to Vovchansk itself, and using the same town, the Ukrainians are sending their forces to the eastern part of Vovchansk, probably with the purpose to concentrate their forces before further counterattack. So, of course, this is a very big road, and just during the previous 24 hours, we got additional videos of how the Russians were hunting and destroying the Ukrainian howitzers, Ukrainian tanks, the Ukrainian artillery systems that they were trying to hide between the, let's say, tree lines. And everything that appears among the fields, the Russians discovered this immediately and destroyed as a result of lancet strike or as a result of counter-artillery duels. One howitzer was destroyed, as you can see, and here we can see another howitzer was destroyed the same way. So very poor logistic, very problematic logistic, and the Ukrainians need to improve their logistic before any attempts to counterattack, before any attempts to force the Russians to fall back. And the only possible, not the only possible, but the best logistic that Ukrainians can do in this direction is from Kharkiv to Kutuzovka to Shestakovo, Peremoga, and then to the area of Rubezhnoye. So to these positions, and this why here, because we have Siverskyi Donets river, and as you can see based on the map, Siverskyi Donets river is not so very wide, and Ukrainians during the previous phase of the special military operation created significant number of bridges, pontoon bridges in the area, which allows them to concentrate and to redeploy forces from one side of Siverskyi Donets river to another. But when the Russians began the Kharkiv offensive operation, the first thing they did, they established complete control over the village by the name of Staritsa. The Russians captured Borgovatka, the Russians captured Agurtsova and Gatishno. So basically the Russians captured a very big part of Siverskyi Donets river, where the river is not so big, where the river is not so wide. And by that the Russians managed to collapse up to 40 or 50% of logistic that Ukrainians were using to support their forces in Vovchansk. So before any attempt to attack the Russians' positions, the Ukrainians first need to restore control over the village by the name of Staritsa and Borgovatka. So this is the first thing they need to do, and if they can do this, then everything might go much better for them if they're planning to move further to the north or something like this. So during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians conducted significant artillery preparation. The forces of 36th Marine Brigade, by the way, just to point your attention, 36th Marine Brigade that 2 months ago was located in Kherson area, that 2 months ago were trying significant number of attempts to cross the Dnieper River and to establish complete control over Krinky. Now this brigade is located in the vicinity of Vovchansk. After the Ukrainians bombed the Russian territory, and after the Ukrainians cleared the Russian territory with a significant number of FPV drone strikes, the Ukrainians made attempt to attack the Russian positions here. But the Russians, of course, discovered, the Russians see everything. They have very good reconnaissance forces in this area, and as soon as the Ukrainians began, let's say, artillery duels, artillery preparation, the Russians started hunting and destroying the Ukrainian howitzers in the vicinity of the village by the name of Rubezhnoye. And as a result of counter-artillery duels, significant number of artillery systems, mortar systems, warehouses were destroyed, and of course the personnel with FPV drones. Furthermore, as soon as the Ukrainians launched their attack to Staritsa and Borgovatka, the Russians activated their movements in direction of Ternova. So the same purpose, the same reason, to attack the Ukrainians in the area where they don't expect any attack, with the purpose to break the Ukrainian plans to capture these two villages. As I understand, according to the situation, according to the configuration, most likely the main Russian forces are concentrated in the forests to the north of Staritsa and Borgovatka. And the same story we can say about the Ukrainians. The main Ukrainian forces are located in the forests to the south of Staritsa and Borgovatka. And due to the configuration and the number of forces the Ukrainians managed to concentrate on this area, most likely during the next few weeks, the Staritsa and Borgovatka, these two villages, will be reduced to ruins, and this territory will become a gray zone. I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are able to restore control control over this territory, because obviously they don't have enough of power to move further to the north inside of this forest, where they would be obviously destroyed by the Russian forces. The same story from the Russian side. Maybe they control Staritsa, but the Russians don't have possibilities to move further to the south. If they enter the southern forest, obviously the Russians would be defeated. So this area is going to be a line of combat contact for a very long time. So the clashes in this direction, as you can see, have started. Furthermore, we got additional very interesting reports from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. For example, the Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours, they dealt significant damage to 57th Motorized Brigade. This brigade was here arrived in this area probably during the first days of, let's say, clashes. Also, the most important, that the Russians inflicted losses to brigades 31st and 110th Mechanized Brigade. And these are new brigades in this area, so as you can see, the Ukrainians continue moving forces. Regarding reports that they finish regrouping, most likely the Ukrainians are going to continue this process. And I'll remind you that 110th Brigade used to be responsible for the protection of Avdiivka, but when the brigade was defeated during the battle for the stronghold, this Avdiivka, that was the core, the base, let's say, brigade in this area. After Avdiivka fell, the Ukrainians redeployed 110th Brigade to, let's say, to restore their combat capabilities. But then the Russians started, let's say, offensive to Ocheretina, and the Ukrainians were forced to introduce 110th Brigade once again to stabilize the situation there. But anyway, the Ukrainians were defeated, so that's why the Ukrainians removed 110th once again, and now we see this brigade operating in the area of Vovchansk. So we see that Ukrainians continue this process, but on the other hand, we start receiving very interesting details and updates from the Russian sources. For example, on this video, we can see, not on this video, not on, even on this. According to information we have, this is this video. On this video, for example, we can see the redeployment of Barbarian FPV drone operator squad, which was responsible for work in Klishchiivka direction. So the Russians also see the concentration of Ukrainian forces, and the Russians also launched the process of concentrating their forces from different directions, because they see the number of forces the Ukrainians have already brought on this area. Furthermore, if we increase the numbers of days for 2 days, we're going to receive additional videos. For example, on this video, we can see the work of artillery forces of 155th Motorized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Russian Federation, not motorized, but this is the brigade of Marine Brigade. And I'll remind you that 155th Brigade was responsible for offensive operation in Novomikhailivka direction. So after the Russians captured Novomikhailivka, 155th Brigade probably was removed to restore combat capabilities. Of course, that was a very heavy, bloody battle, and now this brigade was redeployed in this direction as well. So as you can see, both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, continue concentrating forces, experienced, not experienced, mobilized, recently mobilized, veterans. And very soon there are going to be very heavy clashes. The NATO summit is going to take place in July. Zelensky and his military authorities doesn't have enough of time. They need to start this offensive probably in a week or in two, right before the beginning of NATO summit, and they need, the most important, to show results. And now it depends on Russia whether they're able to repel and to defeat the Ukrainians. If they can do this, most likely during the summit, July NATO summit, Ukrainians will not receive anything. But if the Russians lose, of course, Ukrainians will receive everything they want. And don't forget that recently the Western countries allowed the Ukrainians to use the Western weapon on the territory of Russian Federation, including bombing the military objects, including bringing down the Russian aircrafts, and of course using long-range missiles as deep as possible. Joe Biden reported that Ukrainians authorized to attack Russian territory within 200 miles deep inside of Russia. So this is going to be very bloody clashes that are going to be. Now let's move to northern Kupiansk direction. We have additional updates. The Russians continue bombing and destroying the Ukrainian positions. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians discovered another concentration of forces, another warehouse in the area, and how the Russians destroyed that warehouse with FAB 250 or 500s. As a result of those attacks, we see the secondary detonation and very heavy fire and very heavy explosions. Meanwhile, the main Russian forces continue offensive operation on the line Ivanovka-Stepovo-Novoselovka, and today the Ukrainian sources published the video we will not watch due to significant number of casualties and losses. The Russians were attacking the Ukrainians on this line, trying to improve and to bypass the Stepovo-Novoselovka from the northeast and from the north. So that was the Russian attempt to attack. The Ukrainians were defeated on this direction, and those who managed to survive from the Ukrainian side were moving and heading to Stepovo-Novoselka. But the Russians were controlling the main supply roads, the main roads of evacuation, and the Russians were bombing and destroying those Ukrainians who were trying to save their lives, running away from Ivanovka to Stepovo-Novoselovka and even further. So the clash is continuous, and most likely during the next few days the Russians will significantly improve their positions, and very likely Stepovo-Novoselka is going to fall very soon. Now let's move further to the south in direction of Stelmakhovka, where the Russians continue offensive operation. The same picture, very heavy explosions, significant number of, let's say, explosions, attacks from the Russian side, aviation, warehouses destroyed, and many other things. On the other hand, we continue receiving updates about further Russian improvements in the village by the name of Rozovka or Andreevka. The Russians captured control around 50% of the village. So anyway, Stelmakhovka is going to fall. It's just a question of time, and most likely this is going to happen very soon. Also, an important update that the Ukrainians have redeployed on this direction 67th Mechanized Brigade, probably to stabilize the situation in the vicinity of Vishnevo, Pershatravnevo, Kopenki, and Mesazherivka. I'll remind you that 67th Brigade was responsible for protection of the eastern Chasiv Yar, but they refused to follow the orders, were removed from the line of combat contact, and now we can see them in Mesazherivka. But 67th Brigade is not the brigade who is going to be sent to the line of combat contact. Their main responsibility is to be, let's say, anti-retreat forces, and most likely the main purpose is not to allow the Ukrainians to fall back and to abandon their positions during the another waves of Russian attacks that are going to take place obviously very soon. Siver's direction, we haven't received almost anything, just another batch of videos of how the Russians were reducing to ruins the village by the name of Sporne. Every single square centimeter was bombed and attacked by the Russians during the previous days, but without any attempt from the Russian side to attack this territory. Now we're moving to Chasiv Yar. We have additional updates. Right before start making the video, we got reports that the Russians crossed the Siverskyi Donets canal completely. We have confirmations. We have video confirmations. We will add the video confirmation before the next morning update that we're going to make tomorrow in the morning. But we have 100% proofs that this territory is already under Russian control, and that the Russians currently are trying to storm the block by the name of Novi, trying to encircle the Ukrainians in the eastern part and not to allow them to evacuate their forces from, let's say, eastern Chasiv Yar to the central one. So the battle in this area is going to be very bloody one also. And of course the situation in Kalinovka is still covered with the fog of war. We don't understand the exact picture there, because sometimes we got geolocations from one side, sometimes from another. So let's keep the area as is, but maybe we'll adjust the map in the very near future. Also, the Russians renewed their activity to the southwest of Klishchiivka. As you can see, we have significant number of geolocations. The Russians during the previous 48 hours conducted significant artillery preparation. They were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian trenches, tree lines, and the fortifications, strongholds to prepare the foothold before further offensive. And most likely, exactly right now, the Russians are trying to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in this area and to capture this stronghold. So the Russians are trying to dig in between two Ukrainian, let's say, defense belt. One defense belt, it's line Ivanovska-Klishchiivka, the second one Klishchiivka-Kurdyumovka, and as soon as the Russians are able to cut this territory into pieces, then they will handle with every single one separately. This is the plan. Now let's move to Avdiivka area. We have lots of very interesting details. According to information we have during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions closer to Kalinova and to establish control over the strongholds among the fields. And according to pro-Ukrainian mappers Deep State, this is approximately the territory that was captured and the territory that is already under Russian control. So the Russians are getting closer, but there is another stronghold further to the east and further to the northeast, the village by the name of Kalinova. So this is not going to be an easy trip. Most likely the Russians were attacking in this direction just to secure and to protect their flanks, while the main Russian forces will continue offensive operation further to the west and northwest in direction of Novoalexandrovka, where we also can see very heavy clashes. Now let's move further to the south. The battle for Sokol continues. We have the videos of how the Ukrainians were abandoning their positions and moving from the trenches and the fortifications on the east further to the west. So most likely this territory will be abandoned by the Ukrainians in the very near future. We got additional videos from this artillery pocket, the area under responsibilities of 47th Brigade. On this video we can see how the Russians managed to discover and to destroy another Ukrainian tank as a result of FPV drone strike. Also we have another video video to the south of Novostylovka-Pershi, and according to the author of this video, the Russians destroyed probably 16 Abrams of armored forces of Ukraine. The Abrams was destroyed by that attack, and we can see this on the video. Also, we got report that Ukrainian 68th Jaeger Brigade lost their combat capabilities completely. The losses during the previous months, let's say, reached the level of 70%, and now the Ukrainians decide how to remove this brigade from the line of combat contact to restore their combat capabilities. Also, we have some the results of Russian strikes in the town by the name of Selidova. This strike was reported by the Ministry of Defense. The Ukrainians suffered significant losses. Now let's move to Krasnogorovka. We have additional updates. The Russians are bombing the central park, the area in the vicinity of the central park, trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the low-rise building area. Most likely the Russians establish complete control over high-rise building area in the central and the western part of Krasnogorovka. Deep State have updated their map showing that the Russians control everything along Sumskaya Street. If summarize everything according to Deep State, this is approximately the territory that is under complete Russian control. Most likely the Russians have better positions and managed to move further to the north. For now we just don't have any geolocations confirming this, but most likely this is exactly what is happening on this direction. So the Ukrainians don't have enough of positions, enough of space, and most likely they would be forced to fall back further to the north. Additional updates we continue seeing from Georgievka. The second day in a row, different Russian channels are saying that the Russians established and control Georgievka completely. The Ukrainians were forced to fall back. The Ukrainians controlled just few buildings in the most western part, but of course it's nothing in comparison with the common Russian progress. Very interesting updates are coming from Novomikhailivka, Paraskovievka, Konstantinovka triangle. The Russians continue effective artillery duels, more precisely 238th Artillery Brigade of Armored Forces of Russian Federation continue destroying the Ukrainian artillery positions, artillery systems. Few more howitzers of Western and old Soviet productions were destroyed. The Russians continue suppressing the Ukrainian forces, trying to, ease the progress of the Russian forces around Konstantinovka itself. As you can see, we have significant focus of FPV drone strikes from Paraskoyevka to Konstantinovka. On this video that was published by the Russians, we see significant number of videos showing the Russians were clearing and hunting the Ukrainian forces in this area, and most likely these strikes, these videos confirms that the Russians are going to attack in Konstantinovka from the north along this line as well. So first they cleared the area with FPV drone strikes, and now the Russians are about to start their offensive, trying to cut the main supply road T0524 between Pobeda and Konstantinovka, and to block the town from the north, to capture the farms, and to establish complete FPV drone and mortar control over the Ukrainian positions inside of the stronghold itself. When talking about Konstantinovka itself, today we got significant number of reports from 79th Air Mobile Brigade, who is responsible for this territory. They are saying that according to them, they managed to conduct a counteroffensive. The Ukrainians managed to counterattack the Russian positions, and as a result of counterattack, they managed to restore some trenches and control over some trenches and strongholds in most western part of Paraskoyevka. Maybe the Ukrainians haven't managed to enter, but they control just the brushes and tree lines. Also, the Ukrainians are saying that currently, and this is official information, official statement from the 79th Brigade, that currently there are very heavy clashes in the southeastern part of Konstantinovka. So according to the Ukrainians, most likely the Russians have entered the Konstantinovka village, and currently the clashes are taking place exactly in this area. The Ukrainians are trying to introduce additional reinforcements and reserves, but also according to 79th Brigade, they have significant problems with reserves. Basically, they have nothing, and they try to slow down the Russians with the forces they have right now on this direction. The Ukrainians are saying that they were forced to stretch their forces around Konstantinovka, entire Konstantinovka itself. Of course, by that they managed to cover every single square meter in this area, but due to this, they have a very slow amount of soldiers on every single square kilometer, on every single square meter, and if the Russians are able to conduct successful attack, the entire defense of Konstantinovka can collapse. So very soon maybe very soon the Russians will capture this village, and then this is going to be significant problem for Vuhledar and Vodiane itself. And as you can see, we have also a lot of geolocations. The Russians become very active with FPV drones among these 3 lines in the fields. We expect additional waves of attack from the Russian side. Now let's move to Vremivka tactical bridgehead. We have adjusted the map between Staromayorskaya and Urozhaynaya. The Russians managed to establish connection between 2 villages. At least they captured the road that Ukrainians were using during the previous months of when they were controlling the territory. We got just one video from the direction. On this video we can see the Russian tank and the personnel carrier were heading to the let's say Mokry Yala river, and on this video we can see how the Russians captured the territory. So we adjusted the map, and most likely the Russians will, let's say, publish additional video during the next few days of additional control further to the north in direction of Makarovka. Rabotina, nothing special, just regular activity, and south-west Zaporizhzhia direction, just regular activity, and some videos of TOS flamethrower strikes on the village by the name of Petykhatki, which confirms that most likely the Russians are going to renew their offensive on this direction as well. Very interesting details we continue receiving from Zaporizhzhia direction. The Russians managed to destroy another Su-25 somewhere in the airfield of Kryvyi Rog as a result of Lancet strike. Another Su-25 the Ukrainians probably were keeping for some operations were destroyed. As you can see, the Ukrainians were trying to jam the Russian drone, but they couldn't do this, and the Russians destroyed the Su-25. Also, we have the satellite pictures from Zelenodolska power plant. This is it, and as you can see, according to the Russian sources, power plant has a smoke above it, which confirms that the power plant still operates. Most likely during the next few days we should expect more missile strikes in this area with the purpose to destroy the power plant completely by the Russians, of course. Kherson direction, if you remember, during the previous days we talk a lot that the Kherson direction is empty. The right bank of Dnieper river is practically empty. Troops from there were deployed to Kharkov. That was stated by the Russian forces on the ground. Just yesterday we were talking that the Russians, as a result of another operation, managed to restore control over Dachi, or probably over the bank of the river in front of Kherson. During the previous night, the Russians conducted a massive missile strike in Kherson itself and destroyed another warehouse in this area where the ammo that Ukrainians were using on this direction. Now the Ukrainians also have problems with supply and support with munition. And we have another important update that after the Ukrainians redeployed most of their forces to Kharkiv, the Russians began the clearing of islands operations. We started receiving the first geolocations confirming that the Russians began moving among the islands, trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back completely. We have one video from the Ukrainian side of how they were FPV droning the Russians in this area. So the Russians started the islands, Dnipro Islands operation, not just in the vicinity of Krynki, not just in front of let's say Kherson, but the Russians are planning to establish complete control over the islands on the line Kizomets, Valentinskaya, Berehova. So I'm not telling you anything, I'm not saying anything, but everything tells me, due to the situation, due to complete lack of reinforcements, reserves, ammo, and different other things, there are very high chances that the Russians at least may try to cross Dnieper River, may try to land their infantry in the vicinity of Kherson, just to check what is the status of Ukrainian defense on this direction. Furthermore, we got a very interesting report from Odessa. The Russians, as a result of strike, destroyed another temporary position. An important thing that today the pro-Western, let's say, resources discovered significant number of ships that started their movements from Novorossiysk to Crimea. Mainly, there is a big marine ships. Maybe the Russians are bringing some cargo with them, or maybe the Russians are planning to start something more, something bigger, somewhere in Odessa area after the Ukrainians have deployed most of their forces to Kharkiv. The Russians have the best chances, the best opportunities to open another front line somewhere in the vicinity Odessa. And maybe right now we are facing something like this, and maybe this is the reason why the NATO Global Hawk, the endless number of NATO Global Hawks are flying above the Black Sea, trying to understand the real Russian plans and whether the Russians are planning to do something like this. Obviously the summer is going to be very hot. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.